October 25, 1944. 0247 hours. The Philippine Sea, 40 nautical miles east of Samar Island. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, his weathered hands gripping the polished brass railing as he surveyed the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since Midway. Through the darkness, he could make out the silhouettes of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. 23 warships carrying enough firepower to obliterate any American surface force foolish enough to challenge them. The Americans had no heavy ships in these waters, their intelligence confirmed it. His fleet would sweep aside whatever token resistance stood between him and the vulnerable American landing forces at Leyte Gulf. In precisely 6 hours, a small group of American destroyer escorts and escort carriers, vessels never designed for surface combat, would engage as armada in what would become the most lopsided naval battle in modern warfare. Except the outcome would shock the Imperial Japanese Navy to its core, not because of American courage alone, but because of a technology Kurita's intelligence officers had assured him the Americans did not possess in significant quantities. His ships would be detected, tracked, and engaged at ranges his lookouts could not even see, by a capability so revolutionary it would fundamentally alter naval warfare forever. What neither Kurita nor his staff knew was that the primitive American escort ships hunting submarines in these waters carried sophisticated radar systems that could detect his massive battleships at distances exceeding 20 miles, allowing them to see in total darkness what his own ships could only guess at. The technological blindness of the Imperial Japanese Navy was about to cost them a victory that seemed mathematically certain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had earned his position through decades of exemplary service in the Imperial Japanese Navy. A graduate of the Naval Academy at Adajima in 1920, he had risen through the ranks by demonstrating exceptional tactical acumen and unwavering dedication to the Emperor. His career had taken him through the evolution of modern naval warfare, from the treaty limitations of the 1920s through the expansionist policies of the 1930s, and into the desperate struggles of 1944. At 55 years old, Kurita represented the finest traditions of Japanese naval leadership, a man who understood both the technical capabilities of modern warships and the spiritual dimensions of naval combat that Japanese doctrine emphasized. His assignment to command the center force represented the Imperial Navy's confidence in his abilities to execute the most critical phase of the Shogo operation, Japan's desperate gamble to destroy American landing forces in the Philippines. The strategic situation that placed Kurita in these waters reflected Japan's increasingly desperate circumstances in October 1944. The American reconquest of the Philippines threatened to sever Japan's vital supply lines to the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. Without the oil, rubber, and raw materials flowing from these conquered territories, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt within months. The Imperial General Headquarters had devised an extraordinarily complex plan involving 3 separate fleet actions designed to draw away American carrier forces and create an opening for Kurita's surface fleet to devastate the invasion transports and supply ships anchored in Leyte Gulf. The plan depended on timing, deception, and the willingness of Japanese commanders to sacrifice their own forces to create opportunities for others. It represented the kind of intricate tactical choreography at which Japanese naval planners excelled, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness of a navy that could no longer afford to lose ships or experienced personnel. The composition of Kurita's center force represented the concentrated striking power of what remained of Japan's battleship fleet. The Yamato, at 70,000 tons and armed with 9 18-inch guns, represented the pinnacle of battleship design. Her sister ship Musashi accompanied her, equally massive and powerful. The older battleships Nagato and Kongo, veterans of earlier campaigns, added their 14-inch guns to the fleet's firepower. 6 heavy cruisers, each displacing over 10,000 tons and armed with 8-inch guns, provided additional offensive capability. 2 light cruisers and 11 destroyers completed the force, creating a balanced fleet designed to annihilate any surface opposition through overwhelming firepower at close range. The total broadside weight these ships could deliver exceeded anything the American Navy could match with surface vessels alone. Japanese naval doctrine had always emphasized the decisive fleet engagement, the climactic battle where superior gunnery and fighting spirit would decide the war's outcome. Kurita commanded the force that embodied this philosophy. The journey that brought Kurita's fleet to these waters had been harrowing and costly. Departing from Brunei on October 22, the center force had transited the Palawan Passage where American submarines had ambushed them on October 23. Two heavy cruisers, the Otago and Maya, had been sunk by torpedo attacks from the submarines Darter and Dace. A third cruiser, Takao, had been so badly damaged she was forced to return to Brunei. Kurita himself had been in the water for several hours after Otago was sunk beneath him before being rescued and transferring his flag to Yamato. The submarine attacks had demonstrated that American forces were aware of his movement and were actively attempting to stop him. Yet Kurita pressed forward because the strategic imperative remained unchanged. If the Shogo operation failed, the Philippines would be lost, and with them any realistic hope of sustaining Japan's war effort. The mission had to continue regardless of losses already sustained. On October 24, Kurita's force had endured devastating air attacks while transiting the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of American carrier aircraft had struck his ships throughout the day. The super battleship Musashi, designed to withstand incredible punishment, had absorbed an estimated 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before finally capsizing and sinking with over 1,000 men aboard. Several other ships had sustained damage, and Kurita's force had been thrown into confusion by the relentless attacks. Late in the afternoon, with his fleet scattered and under continuous assault, Kurita had made the controversial decision to temporarily reverse course, appearing to retreat westward away from his objective. American commanders, observing this apparent withdrawal through reconnaissance aircraft, concluded that the center force had been defeated and was retiring from the battle. This assessment proved catastrophically premature. After darkness fell on October 24, Kurita resumed his advance towards San Bernardino Strait, the narrow passage that would allow his fleet to emerge into the Philippine Sea and approach Leyte Gulf from the north. His ships reformed and increased speed, navigating the strait during the night while American carrier forces, believing the threat had been eliminated, steamed southward to engage other elements of the Japanese fleet. The complex Japanese plan was working better than anyone had expected. The sacrifice of the southern force and the deliberate exposure of Japanese carriers to the north had successfully drawn away the American carrier groups. When Kurita emerged from San Bernardino Strait in the early morning hours of October 25, no American heavy ships stood between his battleships and the vulnerable transports and supply vessels supporting the Leyte landings. The moment of decisive victory appeared at hand. The night passage through San Bernardino Strait had been executed flawlessly despite its navigational challenges. The strait was narrow, barely 10 miles wide at its tightest point, with treacherous currents and numerous small islands that created navigation hazards even in daylight. Kurita's force had traversed it in darkness, maintaining formation discipline and emerging into the Philippine Sea exactly on schedule. The success of this maneuver seemed to validate the entire operation. The most dangerous phase of the approach had been completed without interference. No American submarines lurked in the strait. No air attacks materialized during the vulnerable transit. The gods of war appeared to favor the Emperor's forces this night. Officers throughout the fleet began to believe that victory might actually be achievable despite the losses sustained in reaching this position. As dawn approached on October 25, Kurita's force steamed southward along the coast of Samar Island at 20 knots. The weather was clear with excellent visibility, conditions that favored his superior gunnery capabilities. His lookouts maintained careful watch for any sign of American forces, but the sea appeared empty. Intelligence reports indicated that American escort carriers, small aircraft carriers designed for anti-submarine warfare and ground support rather than fleet combat, were operating somewhere in the area. These vessels, if encountered, would be easy prey for his battleships. Escort carriers were thin-skinned ships with minimal armor, slow speed, and only a handful of aircraft. A single salvo from Yamato's 18-inch guns could destroy one. The prospect of catching these vulnerable ships at sea filled Kurita with satisfaction. Finally, after days of enduring submarine attacks and airstrikes without being able to effectively retaliate, his surface fleet would engage enemies they could actually fight. What Kurita did not know, what his intelligence officers had failed to communicate or perhaps failed to understand, was that American technological development had advanced far beyond what Japanese assessments predicted. The Imperial Japanese Navy's intelligence apparatus had systematically underestimated American industrial capacity, technological innovation, and operational capabilities throughout the war. This pattern of underestimation stemmed partly from cultural assumptions about Western decadence and partly from genuine intelligence failures that prevented Japanese commanders from understanding the true state of American military technology. Japanese naval doctrines still emphasized visual sighting, optical range-finding, and the spiritual superiority of Japanese seamen. While the Imperial Navy had developed its own radar systems, they were primitive compared to American equivalents and were not yet widely deployed or trusted by commanders who had built their careers on traditional methods. The Japanese had observed American ships using radar but had not grasped the sophistication these systems had achieved or their decisive impact on naval combat. American radar technology in 1944 represented one of the war's most significant technological achievements, a revolution in combat capability that was still not fully appreciated even by many American commanders. The development of centimetric radar using cavity magnetron technology had created systems capable of detecting surface ships at ranges that seemed impossible just years earlier. The SG Surface Search Radar, standard equipment on American destroyers by late 1944, could reliably detect large surface vessels at ranges exceeding 20 miles under favorable conditions. More importantly, these radar systems could provide accurate range and bearing information that could be used to direct gunfire against targets that were not yet visible to optical rangefinders. This capability fundamentally changed surface combat by eliminating the advantage that superior optical equipment and highly trained lookouts had traditionally provided. In darkness, fog, rain, or smoke, American ships could engage targets that Japanese vessels could not even detect. The implications of this technological revolution would become horrifyingly clear to Kurita's force within hours. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The specific radar sets equipping American escort destroyers and destroyer escorts in October 1944 were remarkably sophisticated for their size and power requirements. The SG radar operated on a wavelength of 10 centimeters, providing resolution sharp enough to distinguish individual ships in a formation and accurate enough to provide fire control solutions. The system featured a rotating antenna that swept the horizon continuously, displaying returns on a cathode ray tube that operators could interpret to determine range, bearing, and relative motion of detected contacts. Training radar operators had become a specialized skill in the American Navy, with operators learning to distinguish genuine targets from sea return, rain clutter, and other interference. The best operators could detect subtle changes in radar signatures that revealed whether contacts were approaching or withdrawing, their approximate size based on the strength of returns, and even estimate their type based on the pattern of reflections. This technology represented a force multiplier that Japanese commanders had not adequately considered when planning their operations. The American forces that would soon encounter Kurita's fleet were designated Task Unit 77.4.3, more commonly known by their radio call sign as Taffy 3. This unit consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, 13 ships in total designed and deployed for missions far different from surface combat against battleships. The escort carriers were essentially merchant ship hulls fitted with flight decks, capable of operating about 30 aircraft each but possessing minimal armor, a maximum speed of only 18 knots, and defensive armament consisting of a single 5-inch gun. They had been built rapidly and cheaply to provide air support for amphibious operations and to escort convoys across the Pacific, hunting submarines and providing air cover against Japanese aircraft. Nobody had imagined these vessels would ever face battleships in surface combat. The destroyers and destroyer escorts accompanying them were equally unsuited for fleet engagement. Destroyers Fletcher and Johnston displaced only 2,500 tons each, armed with 5-inch guns and torpedoes but lacking the armor or firepower to engage capital ships under normal circumstances. The destroyer escorts were even smaller and more lightly armed, designed primarily for anti-submarine warfare rather than surface combat. Commander Ernest E. Evans commanded the destroyer Johnston, the ship that would play a crucial role in the coming engagement. A Native American of Cherokee and Creek descent, Evans had graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1931 and had worked his way up through the ranks to command his own ship. When Johnston was commissioned in October 1943, Evans had addressed his crew with words that defined his command philosophy and foreshadowed his actions in the battle to come. He told his men that they were going to go in harm's way, that the ship would fight and anyone who did not wish to go along had better get off right then. This aggressive spirit reflected the difference between American and Japanese command culture. While Japanese doctrine emphasized coordination within the larger fleet and obedience to detailed battle plans, American doctrine increasingly empowered individual commanders to make tactical decisions based on their assessment of situations as they developed. Evans embodied this aggressive, independent approach to command, and his ship's crew had trained to execute attacks with minimal preparation or detailed orders. The technological capabilities aboard Johnston and her sister ships represented the cutting edge of American naval development, though the ships themselves were small and lightly built. Beyond the SG surface search radar, these vessels carried sophisticated fire control radars that could track targets and compute firing solutions automatically. The Mark 37 fire control system integrated radar tracking with mechanical computers that calculated the ballistic trajectory required to hit a maneuvering target at range. This system allowed accurate fire at targets that were not visually observed, a revolutionary capability that Japanese ships simply did not possess in equivalent form. American destroyers also benefited from superior damage control training, better internal communication systems, and a culture of tactical innovation that encouraged junior officers to take initiative. These advantages would prove decisive when skill and determination confronted overwhelming material superiority. The pre-dawn darkness on October 25 found Taffy 3 operating approximately 50 miles east of Samar Island, steaming in a standard anti-submarine patrol formation. The escort carriers were conducting routine air operations, launching aircraft for combat air patrol and ground support missions over Leyte. Nobody expected surface action because American intelligence had concluded that Kurita's center force had been defeated and forced to retreat the previous day. The massive airstrikes on October 24 had sunk Musashi and damaged multiple other ships, and reconnaissance aircraft reported the Japanese force turning away from San Bernardino Strait. The American carrier groups, including the fast battleships that could have easily destroyed Kurita's force, had steamed southward to engage Japanese forces approaching from the south. San Bernardino Strait, the northern approach to Leyte Gulf, had been left unguarded based on the assumption that no threat remained from that direction. This intelligence failure stemmed from multiple factors including inadequate reconnaissance during the night hours, overconfidence in the damage assessment from the previous day's airstrikes, and failures in communication between different American commands. The result was that Taffy 3 and 2 other similar escort carrier groups were the only American forces positioned to intercept Kurita when he emerged from the strait. At 0637 hours on October 25, radar operators aboard the destroyer escort Raymond detected surface contacts bearing north-northwest at a range of 17 miles. The contacts were numerous and large, moving at high speed directly toward Taffy 3's position. The radar operator reported the contacts to the bridge immediately, but the initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm. Large surface contacts in that direction seemed impossible given the previous day's intelligence assessments. The officer of the deck questioned whether the radar might be detecting friendly ships, possibly American vessels returning from operations farther north. Within minutes, however, additional radar contacts confirmed that a large surface force was indeed approaching at high speed. The number and size of the radar returns indicated capital ships, heavy cruisers at minimum and possibly battleships. The bearing and speed of the contacts eliminated any possibility that these were friendly forces. At approximately the same moment, lookouts in the escort carrier formation spotted distinctive pagoda-style masts on the northern horizon, the unmistakable silhouette of Japanese battleships. What radar had detected at 17 miles was now becoming visible to the naked eye as the rising sun illuminated the enemy fleet. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded Taffy 3 from his flagship, the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay. A 1918 Naval Academy graduate, Sprague was an aviator who had spent most of his career in naval aviation rather than surface warfare. His command consisted of vessels designed for support roles, and his mission was to provide air cover and ground support for the Leyte operation, not to engage in surface combat. When reports of the Japanese fleet reached him, Sprague's initial reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by the recognition that his force faced potential annihilation. The tactical situation was hopeless by any conventional assessment. 6 escort carriers, maximum speed 18 knots, armed with single 5-inch guns, faced 4 Japanese battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and numerous smaller vessels approaching at speeds exceeding 25 knots. The Japanese force could close the range within an hour and destroy every American ship with gunfire before suffering significant damage themselves. The escort carriers could not outrun the Japanese ships. They could not effectively fight them with their minimal armament. The only hope was to delay the Japanese long enough for the escort carriers' aircraft to launch and perhaps damage or slow the enemy force while calling desperately for help from American carrier groups operating far to the south. Sprague immediately ordered his carriers to turn east toward a nearby rain squall that might provide concealment and to increase speed to their maximum capability. He ordered all available aircraft launched immediately regardless of whether they were properly armed for attacking surface ships. He ordered the destroyers and destroyer escorts to make smoke to conceal the carriers from Japanese optical range-finding. And he sent urgent radio messages calling for assistance from any American forces within range, though he knew that help could not possibly arrive in time to prevent the destruction of his task unit. These orders represented the sum total of options available to him. Everything that followed would depend on the courage and initiative of individual ship commanders, the effectiveness of American technology, and sheer desperate determination to survive against impossible odds. The battle about to unfold would demonstrate that radar, courage, and aggressive tactics could at least partially compensate for overwhelming material disadvantage, though the cost would be terrible. Aboard Yamato, Japanese lookouts reported sighting the American escort carriers at approximately 0644 hours. The range was estimated at 25,000 meters, well within the maximum range of Yamato's 18-inch guns. Kurita immediately ordered his fleet to attack, signaling a general engagement that allowed his ships to operate independently in pursuit of targets. This decision reflected standard Japanese doctrine for surface combat, which emphasized aggressive pursuit and decisive engagement at close range where superior Japanese gunnery would prove decisive. What Kurita did not immediately appreciate was that this approach played into American strengths rather than exploiting Japanese advantages. By ordering a general chase rather than maintaining formation discipline, Kurita allowed his faster heavy cruisers to race ahead of his battleships while his slower vessels fell behind. This dispersion of force meant that his overwhelming firepower advantage would never be applied in concentrated fashion. Individual Japanese ships would engage piecemeal against American vessels that, while vastly outgunned, could use radar to maintain awareness of the entire tactical situation and coordinate their defensive actions accordingly. The first Japanese salvos fell near the American carriers at approximately 0659 hours. Massive shells, some weighing over a ton each, created enormous splashes that drenched the small carriers with seawater. The shells were visible in flight, appearing as dark streaks against the dawn sky, and the sound of their passage was a terrifying shriek that grew louder as they descended. The initial salvos were colored, red and green dye mixed with the explosive to help Japanese spotters distinguish which ship's shells were landing where. This colorful display would have been fascinating under other circumstances, but to the American sailors watching massive shells bracket their ships, the colors represented deadly beauty. The Japanese gunnery was accurate, straddling the carriers with the first few salvos and quickly finding the range. Within minutes, shells began hitting, and the thin-skinned escort carriers proved as vulnerable as their design specifications suggested. The escort carrier Kalinin Bay took multiple hits that caused serious damage but somehow failed to sink her immediately. The carrier Gamber Bay was hit repeatedly and began falling behind the formation, slowing as damage accumulated and making her an easier target for the pursuing Japanese cruisers. The technological advantage of American radar became immediately apparent in how the American destroyers and destroyer escorts maneuvered to engage the Japanese fleet. While Japanese lookouts had spotted the American carriers and opened fire based on visual sighting and optical rangefinding, the American escorts had been tracking the entire Japanese force by radar from the moment first contact was established at 17 miles. This meant that American commanders possessed a complete picture of the tactical situation, including the position, bearing, speed, and formation of every Japanese ship. They could identify which enemy vessels posed the greatest immediate threat and could maneuver to engage those specific ships even before they were visible. This information advantage allowed the American escorts to execute coordinated attacks against specific targets while using smoke screens and rain squalls for concealment. The Japanese, lacking equivalent radar capabilities, were forced to react to threats as they emerged from smoke and weather rather than tracking all American vessels continuously. This fundamental difference in situational awareness would prove decisive in allowing the vastly outnumbered American force to inflict damage far beyond what their material capabilities suggested possible. Commander Evans aboard Johnston made his decision immediately upon sighting the Japanese fleet. Without waiting for orders from Admiral Sprague or coordinating with other escorts, Evans turned Johnston directly toward the approaching Japanese force and increased speed to flank. His intention was to execute a torpedo attack against the Japanese heavy cruisers that were leading the chase, closing to effective torpedo range and launching his full spread of 10 Mark 15 torpedoes before the cruisers could close within effective gun range of the American carriers. This decision was tactically irrational by conventional standards. A single destroyer attacking a force of battleships and cruisers should expect to be destroyed quickly, and even if torpedoes were successfully launched, the sacrifice of the destroyer would only minimally delay the Japanese force. But Evans understood something that conventional tactical analysis missed. The value of time in this engagement exceeded the value of preserving his own ship. Every minute that Johnston could delay or distract Japanese ships was another minute for the escort carriers to launch aircraft and open the range. If Johnston could damage or sink even one heavy cruiser, the psychological impact on Japanese commanders might cause hesitation that would save the carriers. The gamble was desperate, but doing nothing guaranteed the carriers' destruction. Therefore Evans attacked. Johnston's charge toward the Japanese force was observed with astonishment by both American and Japanese forces. On the escort carriers, sailors watched the small destroyer emerge from the smoke screen and head directly toward the massive enemy battleships in what appeared to be a suicidal gesture. In the Japanese fleet, lookouts reported the attacking destroyer with confusion, uncertain why a single small vessel would attempt such a hopeless attack. For several minutes, Japanese cruisers ignored Johnston, focusing their fire on the more valuable carrier targets. This gave Johnston precious time to close the range while using her radar to track the optimal firing position. At approximately 0710 hours, at a range of 10,000 yards, Johnston launched her full spread of 10 torpedoes targeted at the leading Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. The torpedoes were fired based on a firing solution calculated using radar tracking of the target's course and speed, allowing accurate launch despite the range and the smoke that partially obscured visual observation. After launching torpedoes, Evans did not retreat to safety but instead turned Johnston to unmask her 5-inch guns and open fire on the Japanese cruisers, adding gunfire to the torpedo attack and ensuring that Japanese attention remained fixed on his ship rather than the carriers. The results of Johnston's torpedo attack exceeded even Evans's hopes. 1 or possibly 2 torpedoes struck Kumano's bow, blowing off perhaps 40 feet of the cruiser's forward section and reducing her speed dramatically. Kumano fell out of formation, her pursuit of the American carriers ended by the damage sustained. The attack demonstrated that American torpedoes, when properly deployed using radar fire control, could effectively engage even heavily armored Japanese warships. More importantly, the attack validated Evans's tactical judgment. By sacrificing his ship's concealment and safety, he had eliminated one enemy cruiser from the chase and had drawn Japanese attention and gunfire toward Johnston and away from the carriers. The cost of this success began mounting immediately as multiple Japanese ships shifted fire to Johnston, bracketing the destroyer with shells from 6-inch and 8-inch guns. At 0730 hours, 3 Japanese cruisers concentrated their fire on Johnston, and the small destroyer began taking hits that caused serious damage. A 6-inch shell penetrated the bridge, killing or wounding most of the officers present and forcing Evans to command his ship from the fantail using messengers to relay orders. Additional hits knocked out half of Johnston's guns, damaged her fire control systems, and killed dozens of crew members. Yet Johnston remained operational and continued fighting, her surviving guns still firing at Japanese cruisers as she maneuvered frantically to avoid the increasingly accurate enemy fire. The morning sun climbed higher above the Philippine Sea, transforming the pre-dawn chaos into a fully illuminated battlefield where the technological disparity between the opposing forces became increasingly apparent to the Japanese commanders. What had begun as what should have been a straightforward pursuit and destruction of inferior American vessels was evolving into something entirely different, something that contradicted every assumption upon which Vice Admiral Kurita had based his tactical decisions. The American escort ships were not behaving as defeated forces should behave. They were maneuvering with precision that suggested they possessed information about Japanese ship positions that should have been impossible to obtain in the smoke and confusion of battle. They were launching attacks from unexpected angles and breaking off engagements before Japanese ships could concentrate fire effectively. Most disturbing of all, they were achieving hits with their gunfire at ranges where visual observation alone should have made accurate fire control nearly impossible. Aboard the battleship Yamato, confusion was mounting among the staff officers attempting to maintain tactical awareness of the developing engagement. The American carriers had disappeared into rain squalls and behind smoke screens, yet somehow the American destroyers and destroyer escorts continued to launch coordinated attacks that suggested they maintained constant awareness of Japanese ship positions. Japanese lookouts would spot an American destroyer emerging from smoke to launch torpedoes. Japanese guns would train toward the target and open fire, but before effective fire could be concentrated, the American ship would disappear back into concealment having already launched its attack. The pattern repeated itself with different American vessels attacking from different angles, creating the impression of a much larger force than actually existed. Japanese doctrine emphasized visual observation and optical rangefinding, capabilities at which Japanese crews excelled through rigorous training. Yet in this engagement, superior Japanese optics and highly trained lookouts were proving inadequate against an enemy that somehow maintained tactical awareness through smoke, rain, and distance. Captain Toshihiro Inaguchi commanded the heavy cruiser Haguro, one of the Japanese ships that had raced ahead of the main force in pursuit of the American carriers. From Haguro's bridge, Inaguchi had watched Johnston's suicidal attack with professional admiration tinged with confusion. The American destroyer had charged directly toward overwhelming force, launched torpedoes with accuracy that suggested precise knowledge of Japanese ship courses and speeds, and had then continued engaging with gunfire despite taking multiple hits. The courage displayed was unquestionable, but the tactical execution suggested capabilities beyond what a single destroyer operating independently should possess. Inaguchi had commanded cruisers throughout the Pacific War and had engaged American destroyers on multiple previous occasions. Those earlier engagements had followed predictable patterns where visual observation dictated tactics and Japanese superiority in night fighting and optical rangefinding provided decisive advantages. This engagement felt different. The Americans were fighting with precision that transcended visual observation, yet Inaguchi could not identify what capability allowed this precision. The destroyer Hull, commanded by Commander Leon S. Kintberger, had followed Johnston into the attack against the Japanese fleet minutes after Evans initiated his torpedo run. Kintberger had observed Johnston's charge and had independently reached the same conclusion that aggressive action represented the only hope of saving the escort carriers. Hull had maneuvered to attack the Japanese battleship Congo, one of the massive capital ships that could destroy an escort carrier with a single salvo if allowed to close within effective range. Using her SG surface search radar to track Congo's position and movement through the smoke and spray, Hull had approached to within 9,000 yards before launching her torpedoes. The radar-directed approach had allowed Hull to maintain optimal position relative to the target's course while using smoke for concealment from Japanese visual observation. After launching torpedoes, Hull had turned to engage with her 5-inch guns, adding gunfire to the torpedo attack exactly as Johnston had done. The coordination between the two destroyers was not the result of detailed planning or radio communication but rather emerged from both commanders independently applying the same aggressive tactical philosophy supported by the same radar technology that allowed them to maintain situational awareness despite visual obscuration. The torpedo attack against Congo achieved its intended effect even though the torpedoes themselves did not strike the battleship. Congo's lookouts spotted the torpedo wakes approaching and the battleship executed emergency maneuvers to avoid the torpedoes, turning away from the pursuing course that would have brought her within gun range of the American carriers. The maneuver consumed valuable time and opened the range between Congo and her intended targets. From the Japanese perspective, the attack appeared to come from nowhere, with torpedoes suddenly materializing from smoke at close range without adequate warning. Japanese doctrine called for destroyers to screen the battle line and provide early warning of torpedo attacks, but in the confusion of the general chase that Kurita had ordered, Japanese destroyers had become separated from the capital ships they were supposed to protect. The American destroyers were exploiting this gap in Japanese defensive arrangement, using their radar to identify and attack the most threatening Japanese ships while those ships lacked adequate destroyer screening to detect and counter the attacks. The systematic nature of the American attacks suggested coordination and planning that contradicted the chaotic appearance of the battle. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland commanded the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, one of the smallest combatants present in the engagement. Destroyer escorts displaced only 1,300 tons, half the size of fleet destroyers like Johnston and Hull, and were armed with only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedo tubes compared to the 5 guns and 10 tubes of fleet destroyers. These ships had been designed specifically for anti-submarine escort duty, with emphasis on endurance and anti-submarine weapons rather than surface combat capability. Nobody had ever imagined that destroyer escorts would engage battleships and cruisers in surface action. Yet Copeland watched the fleet destroyers charging the Japanese line and reached the same conclusion they had reached. The escort carriers would be destroyed unless someone delayed the Japanese pursuit, and every ship capable of fighting had a responsibility to do so regardless of the odds or the apparent hopelessness of the situation. Copeland addressed his crew over the ship's public address system, telling them that this would be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival was unlikely, but that their duty was clear and they would fulfill it. The crew responded not with resignation but with determined preparation for battle, manning their stations and preparing their weapons with the calm professionalism that American naval training had instilled. Samuel B. Roberts began her attack run at approximately 0750 hours, nearly an hour after the engagement had begun. By this time, the ocean between the American carriers and the Japanese fleet had become a confused melee of ships maneuvering frantically amid smoke, shell splashes, and the wakes of torpedoes. The destroyer escort used her radar to navigate through this chaos, identifying a Japanese heavy cruiser as her primary target and maneuvering to achieve optimal torpedo firing position. The cruiser was the Chokai, a vessel displacing over 10,000 tons and armed with 10 8-inch guns, representing more than 7 times the displacement and vastly greater firepower than the tiny destroyer escort approaching her. The disparity was so extreme as to be almost comical under other circumstances, but Copeland and his crew were not thinking about disparities or odds but rather about the mechanics of getting close enough to launch torpedoes before being destroyed. The radar allowed Samuel B. Roberts to approach through smoke while maintaining constant awareness of the target's position and movement, an approach that would have been impossible relying on visual observation alone. At a range of 4,000 yards, closer than any previous American torpedo attack, Samuel B. Roberts launched her 3 torpedoes at Chokai. The extreme close range meant the torpedoes had minimal time in the water before reaching the target, giving the Japanese cruiser almost no opportunity to maneuver. At least one torpedo struck Chokai in the engineering spaces, causing catastrophic damage that flooded multiple compartments and brought the cruiser to a halt. Chokai would eventually be scuttled by Japanese destroyers after efforts to tow her to safety failed. the destroyer escort had achieved what should have been impossible, a successful torpedo attack by the smallest and most lightly armed American vessel present against one of the most powerful Japanese cruisers in the engagement. After launching torpedoes, Samuel B. Roberts turned to engage Chokai with her two 5-inch guns, maintaining fire even as the crippled but still dangerous Japanese cruiser returned fire with her 8-inch batteries. The duel was absurdly one-sided in terms of weight of metal, but Samuel B. Roberts had already accomplished her mission by crippling a major enemy combatant. Whatever happened to the destroyer escort now, she had justified her existence and the sacrifice of her crew. The damage inflicted on the Japanese fleet by the American destroyers and destroyer escorts was remarkable given the extreme disparity in force, but the impact on Japanese command decision-making proved even more significant than the material damage. Vice Admiral Kurita, attempting to control the battle from Yamato while his faster cruisers raced ahead and his various ships became dispersed across miles of ocean, was receiving reports that made increasingly little sense from the perspective of conventional naval tactics. Multiple heavy cruisers had been torpedoed by what appeared to be coordinated attacks from different directions. American destroyers were appearing from smoke at close range, launching attacks, and disappearing before they could be destroyed. The American carriers that should have been easy prey were maintaining distance despite being slower than the pursuing Japanese ships, suggesting they possessed better information about Japanese movements than their observed behavior indicated. Most disturbing, Japanese ships were taking gunfire hits from American destroyers at ranges exceeding 10,000 yards, ranges at which visual fire control should have made such accuracy impossible given the target maneuvers and the smoke obscuration. The only explanation that made sense was that American forces were far more numerous than initially assessed, that multiple destroyer squadrons must be present to achieve the observed effects. This conclusion was wrong but appeared logical given the information available to Kurita. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.